Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of Mao Zedong, a political and intellectual portrait by Maurice Meisner. Chapter 3 is titled Peasant Revolution. When Mao Zedong, under threat of execution, fled Hunan in the autumn of 1925, the Great Revolutionary Upsurge of 1925 to 7 was well underway. Enraged by the incident of May 30th, 1925, Chinese workers concentrated in such treaty port cities as Canton and Shanghai joined in unprecedented numbers in a wave of strikes and nationalist political demonstrations, launching one of the most militant working class movements in the history of the 20th century. The city of Canton was the political center of the revolutionary movement that quickly spread to the major cities and much of the countryside of South and Central China during 1926. It was largely on the basis of the burgeoning popular movement that Sun Yat-sen had secured the power of the Kuomintang in Canton, and it was the militant workers' movement with the very considerable assistance of peasants from nearby Haifeng County that enabled Sun's successors to proclaim a national revolutionary government in mid-1925. Canton thus became the center of the Communist Kuomintang alliance, and it was on the nearby island of Whampoa that Sun's imported Russian advisors trained the officer corps of the Nationalist Army and installed the Soviet-trained military officer Chiang Kai-shek as its commander. The new section, the discovery of the peasantry. Despite the militant proletarian movement that thrived in Canton, Mao Zedong had little interest in the urban working class when he arrived in the, quote, Red City of Canton in the fall of 1925. Mao devoted his first 2 years as a communist to organizing workers in his native Hunan under less favorable conditions than prevailed in Canton, but he now all but ignored the successfully rebellious workers in favor of potentially rebellious peasants. No sooner had he resumed his position in the CCP in Kuomintang than he emphasized the need to organize, quote, those broad peasant masses who constitute 80% of the population of Guangdong, unquote, Mao. In January 1926, Mao published a detailed and remarkably astute analysis of rural China's social structure, denouncing, quote, big landlords, not only as exploiters of the peasantry, but also as the, quote, real foundations of imperialism and the warlords, unquote. In short, as the main enemy of the national revolution. The heretical implication was that the Chinese Revolution mainly would be a rural revolution. Early in 1926, Mao, then acting head of the GMD propaganda department, complained that, quote, we have concentrated too much on city people and neglected the peasantry, unquote. Mao. And throughout the year, he would repeatedly emphasize that a peasant revolution was the key to success in the national revolution. It was the exploitation of the peasants by landlords, Mao argued, that financed the warlords who in turn supported the comprador class as their, quote, retainers. The decisive battles of the national revolution, then, were to be fought more in the countryside than in the cities. Mao thus proclaimed, quote, every place in China must become like Haifeng, unquote. Haifeng was the rural county where Peng Pai, the son of a landlord who had gone, quote, back to the people, unquote, had been organizing peasants since 1922, and where, in 1927, he was to establish China's first, although short-lived Soviet government. By 1926, Mao had set forth two interrelated propositions, both heretical in Marxist terms, that were to become critical features of the doctrine that would be canonized as the thought of Mao Zedong. First, he rejected the Marxist assumption that the triumph of capitalism definitively established the dominance of the city over the countryside in the making of modern history. Mao had little taste for Marx's triumphal assertion in the manifesto of the Communist Party, quote, the bourgeoisie has subjected the countryside to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life, unquote. Marx. Secondly, Mao also rejected the central Marxist belief that modern history revolved around the two urban classes in which capitalism was progressively dividing society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. By 1926, Mao had come to be far more concerned with the struggle between landlords and peasants than the conflict between capitalists and workers, and he now believed that peasants, at least in China, were potentially more revolutionary than the urban proletariat. Mao's discovery of the revolutionary promise of the peasantry reflected itself in a radically new understanding of 19th century Chinese history. His great historical hero from childhood well into his adult years had been the Hunanese imperial viceroy Zheng Guofang, who had bloodily suppressed the Great Taiping Peasant Rebellion in the mid-19th century. Mao had always portrayed Zheng as a morally upright Confucian statesman and had celebrated his restoration of social order. He now arrived at a far different historical assessment. Quote, the Taiping king, Hong Shiquan, called on a broad group of unemployed peasants to rise up and make revolution, and this had great significance as a social revolution, ... Everyone knows that the Qing dynasty overthrew him, but they don't know that the main military force which really overthrew him represented the landlord class, the one who contributed the greatest effort toward the overthrow of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was Zheng Guofan. At that time, he was the leader of the landlord class, unquote. Mao. In 1926, the revolutionary movement grew in scope and social radicalism. Mao Zedong, curiously, was far more active in the leadership of the Kuomintang than he was in the Communist Party. It was not simply because of his efforts to exert communist influence in the party under whose banner the, quote, National Revolution proceeded that Mao devoted himself to the affairs of the Nationalist Party. Rather, it was because most Chinese communist leaders were indifferent to the peasant movement. The intellectual roots of communist distrust of peasants ran deep in the Marxist tradition. Karl Marx not only had written about, quote, the idiocy of rural life, unquote, but also about the forthcoming disappearance of the peasantry under capitalist forces of production, the inability of peasants to articulate their own social interest, and the likelihood that they were to play a reactionary political role and provide mass support for Bonapartist personality cults. Leninist revolutionary strategy, growing out of conditions in largely agrarian Russia, provided a more meaningful, if still very limited, revolutionary role for peasants than original Marxism. The peasantry, according to Lenin, could serve as a substitute for a politically timid bourgeoisie in alliance with the proletariat, carrying out the, quote, bourgeois democratic phase of the revolution. In that alliance, the peasantry would be the junior partner to be, quote, led by the proletariat, or more precisely by a communist party which presumably embodied, quote, proletarian consciousness. Nonetheless, Leninist revolutionary strategy, however ambiguous on agrarian matters, in many respects emphasized that peasant participation was necessary in the making of modern revolution, especially in economically undeveloped lands. The views of the Chinese Communist Party Secretary General Chen Duxiu on peasants were closer to those of Marx than Lenin. Quote, the peasants are scattered and their forces are not easy to concentrate, end quote, Chen Duxiu wrote in 1923, echoing the orthodox Marxist assessment. The peasants', quote, culture is low, end quote, Chen maintained. Quote, their desires in life are simple and they easily tend toward conservatism. These environmental factors make it difficult for the peasants to participate in the revolutionary movement, end quote. Chen Duxiu. Chen's image of peasants was one generally shared by Chinese communist leaders in the 1920s. Most of those leaders had come from a westernized intelligentsia whose members typically looked at peasants as simplistic, uncultured, and the carriers of all that was archaic in Chinese society and culture. Marxism reinforced that image. While Mao Zedong was by no means the only or the first Chinese communist leader to advocate a peasant-based revolution, he did soon become the most formidable critic of the policies of the urban-oriented leaders of the party, especially the policies of Chen Duxiu. His relationship with Chen became strained shortly after he arrived in Canton in the fall of 1925, following several months of detailed rural investigations and radical organizational activities. Mao's difficulties with party leaders originated over questions of agrarian policy, he later recalled. Quote, on the basis of my study and my work in organizing the Hunan peasants, I wrote 2 pamphlets, one called An Analysis of the Different Classes of Chinese Society. Chen Duxiu opposed my opinions which advocated a radical land policy and vigorous organization of the peasantry under the Communist Party, and Chen Duxiu refused to publish them in the Communist Central organs. End quote. Mao. The hostility of party leaders to his newly found faith in the peasantry led to Mao's growing estrangement, if not necessarily from communism in general, then certainly from the Chinese Communist Party in particular. This in turn resulted in his deeper immersion in the affairs of the Kuomintang. The Nationalist Party, while partly a refuge for Mao, also offered positive appeals. For it was a party whose leaders, particularly those who constituted its left wing, demonstrated far more sensitivity to the plight of the peasantry and their political potential than their Communist Party counterparts, at least before the purge of radical Kuomintang members carried out by Chiang Kai-shek in 1927. In the mid-1920s, the Nationalist Party, unlike the Communist Party, had established a variety of departments concerned with rural problems, including an institute to train peasant organizations. Thus, in 1926 and through the first 6 months of 1927, Mao devoted most of his time and energies to the Kuomintang and stood aloof from Communist Party politics. He occupied a large number of important Kuomintang positions, including principal of the Peasant Movement Training Institute from May to October 1926. But Mao's rise in the Kuomintang hierarchy was cut short, for the Nationalist Communist Alliance, which had stimulated and led the massive popular movement that swept much of China in 1925 to 27, could not survive the successes of the radical social movement that had proceeded under its political auspices. Once exploited workers and impoverished peasants were politically activated, their increasingly radical demands could not be confined to the bourgeois limits of the quote, National Revolution that the communists in Kuomintang had brokered. Chinese workers struck at factories owned by Chinese capitalists as well as those owned by foreigners. And millions of rebellious peasants threatened the lands and privileges of Chinese, not foreign landlords. The mass movement, in short, threatened property, and the propertied classes in both town and countryside placed themselves under the protection of the Kuomintang, the party that now promised order. More precisely, landlords and capitalists fled into the arms of Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang, for his part, turned his Soviet-built army to the task of destroying his communist allies and crushing the radical trade unions in the cities and the peasant associations in the rural areas. Chiang Kai-shek began with a brutal attack on communist and workers' organizations in Shanghai in April 1927. From here, the orgy of counter-revolutionary violence spread to other cities under the control of the nationalist and warlord armies. But the greatest slaughter took place in the countryside and the suppression of the peasant unions. The quote, white terror of the next few years was to take millions of lives, most of them in rural areas. It's hardly surprising that the repression fell hardest on the peasantry. The peasant revolutionaries were not only far greater in number than the urban working class, they were also more socially radical. Factory workers in the cities could strike and demonstrate, which they did in heroic fashion, but peasants began to seize and redistribute land, directly threatening not only rural landlords but also their sons, who made up the bulk of the officer corps of the nationalist army, as well as the urban bourgeoisie who were heavily invested in the countryside as absentee landlords and mortgage holders. More than any other factor was the social radicalism of the peasantry in 1926 and early 1927 that broke apart the Kuomintang Communist Alliance and provoked the violent counter-revolution that began in the cities but took its greatest human toll in the countryside. Mao Zedong played an important part in the upsurge of peasant radicalism that swept the Chinese countryside in late 1926. During his 6 months as principal of the Kuomintang Peasant Movement Training Institute, he instructed many of the cadres who became organizers of peasant associations in southern and central provinces in the wake of the Nationalist Army's northern expedition. Therefore, he undertook to investigate the disparate and social and economic conditions of peasants in several districts of the provinces of Jiangsu and Zhejiang. For all their backbreaking labor, Mao observed, the peasants were left in a, quote, condition of tragic misery. In addition to natural disasters, there were also the exorbitant taxes of the warlords and greedy officials, plus the heavy rents and high interests charged by landlords, layer upon layer of crushing exploitation. For this reason, many peasants are running away and becoming bandits, unquote. Mao. The graphic report Mao wrote on the basis of his investigations powerfully conveyed his empathy for the plight of the peasantry as well as a keen appreciation of their political potential. At the beginning of January 1927, Mao Zedong returned to Hunan to continue his study of agrarian conditions. His, quote, report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan, unquote, written after a month of intensive research in 5 countries, is an extraordinary document that announces many of the essential themes that were to go into making of the doctrine that came to be known as, quote, Maoism. New section, the, quote, Hunan Report of the Birth of Maoism and the Birth of Maoism. The Hunan Report, Benjamin Schwartz once observed, quite, might just as well have been written by a Russian Narodnik as by a Marxist-Leninist, unquote. Indeed, the lengthy document that Mao Zedong submitted to the Communist Party of China Central Committee in late February 1927 echoed many of the beliefs of the young Russian populist intellectuals who went to the countryside in the 1870s to, quote, merge with the people. beliefs that romantically prized the revolutionary spontaneity of the peasantry. Mao is not directly influenced by populist ideas or by the heroic example of the Russian, quote, go to the people movement. He did not read Herzen and Chernyshevsky, and he was only dimly aware of the Narodniki. Mao no doubt was exposed to certain populist notions that came under the aegis of Kropotkin's anarchism, writings that had so greatly influenced him in his pre-Marxist days. But the populist strain in his own thought was less the result of Russian intellectual influences than his own political experiences in the Chinese countryside in the summer of 1925, when a politically disenchanted Mao was regenerated by the spontaneous peasant radicalism he observed in his native province. In a sense, his populist beliefs can be seen as the typical response of an alienated intellectual in an agrarian land experiencing the social disruptions of early industrialism and seeking a non-capitalist path of development. Just as the Russian populace placed their revolutionary hopes in what they assumed to be an inherently socialist peasantry, not yet corrupted by capitalist relationships, so Mao looked to the elementary revolutionary energies of the Chinese peasantry. Quote, the peasant upsurge of the peasant movement is a colossal event, end quote, he passionately wrote. Quote, in a very short time, several hundred million peasants in China's central, southern, and northern provinces will rise like a fierce wind or tempest, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to suppress it. They will break through all the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will, in the end, send all imperialist warlords, corrupt officials, local bullies, and bad gentry to their graves, end quote. Not only did Mao celebrate the revolutionary energies of the peasants, Mao did so in the belief that they were acting on their own, as an elemental tornado-like force that rose from the depths of their oppression. The peasants were not guided by political parties or dependent on the support of other social classes. Indeed, Mao's, quote, report was remarkable for a Marxist in that it barely mentions the urban working class. Not even a ritualistic bow was made to the, quote, leadership of the proletariat, end quote, or even to the Communist Party, presumably the incarnation of, quote, proletarian consciousness. Mao quite explicitly defied Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, quote, to give credit where credit is due, if we allot 10 points to the accomplishment of the democratic revolution, then the achievements of the city dwellers and the military rate only 3 points, while the remaining 7 points should go to the achievements of the peasants in the rural revolution, end quote. Mao. Yet the spontaneity that Mao prized, Lenin had distrusted, and that distrust went into the making of the Leninist concept of the Revolutionary Party. The spontaneous movement of the masses, Lenin argued, was an insufficient condition for revolution. If left to itself, the spontaneity of the people would eventually result in an accommodation with the existing order. What was required to yield a revolutionary outcome was the imposition of the Marxist consciousness of the intelligentsia on the amorphous movement of the masses, channeling the diffuse revolutionary spontaneity of the people into effective political action. The embodiment of that all-important revolutionary consciousness was a highly centralized and tightly knit party organization presided over by a dedicated elite of professional revolutionaries. In Mao Zedong's Hunan report, there was no suggestion that the spontaneous revolutionary strivings of the masses were to be disciplined by any political party. Mao assumed that the peasants themselves possessed the standards of political judgment that Marxist-Leninists attributed to the Communist Party. It was not the party that was to judge the revolutionary actions of the peasantry, but rather it was the peasants who were to judge the revolutionary sufficiency of the party. As Mao bluntly put it, quote, all revolutionary parties and all revolutionary comrades will stand before them, the peasants, to be tested, to be accepted or rejected as they decide, end quote. Mao. Mao Zedong was doubly heretical from the viewpoint of orthodox Marxism-Leninism. First, he departed from Marx as well as Lenin by identifying the peasantry rather than the proletariat as the main revolutionary class. Secondly, he defied Lenin by favoring the spontaneous revolutionary creativity of the masses over the organized revolutionary consciousness of the party. To be sure, Mao soon was to come to appreciate the efficacy of Leninist organizational principles, and he was to be the leader of a party organized according to those elitist principles. But Mao never fully resolved the old populist dilemma of the relationship between the, quote, consciousness of the intellectuals and the, quote, spontaneity of the masses in a purely Leninist fashion. Mao's belief in the Communist Party as the organizational incarnation of socialist consciousness clashed with a persisting populist faith, expressed in its most pristine form in the, quote, Hunan report. The true that true revolutionary creativity resided in the peasants themselves. The tension between these conflicting quote, Leninist and quote, populist impulses became a persisting feature of the thought of Mao Zedong. And it was this unresolved tension that was in no small measure responsible for the ambiguous and sometimes hostile relationship between the person of Mao Zedong and the institution of the Chinese Communist Party. From these unorthodoxies, other heresies flowed. One was the inversion of the Marxist view of the relationship between town and countryside in the making of modern history. For Marx and for Lenin as well, the dominance of the cities over the countryside was a necessary and progressive outcome of modern history. As part of this process, the peasantry would disappear under the pressure of capitalist forces of production. As Engels summed up the Marxist view, quote, "Our small peasant, like every other survival of a past mode of production, is hopelessly doomed. He is a future proletarian," end quote. Mao. In 1927, Mao's familiarity with Marxist literature still cursory. Mao Zedong was probably unaware of Marxian predictions about the fate of the peasantry, which he no doubt would have ignored in any case. However, he was well aware of the limitations that Marxist-Leninist theory placed on the political role of the peasantry, for these ideological restraints had been repeatedly set forth by Chinese Communist Party leaders and Comintern agents. But he disregarded the ideological orthodoxy. For Mao, the peasants constituted not only the overwhelming majority of the Chinese population, but were the truly revolutionary class in Chinese society, politically more important than the city workers and the military put together. The belief in the revolutionary primacy of the countryside and its inhabitants over the cities was not only an inversion of Marx and Lenin, but it bred over the years a powerful anti-urban bias that was entirely foreign to the Marxist tradition. In the Hunan Report, Mao's anti-urbanism was still muted and mostly implicit, but it found one of its first expressions in a hostility to urban educators who promoted foreign learning and ignorance of the needs of the peasants. Quote, "See how the peasants who hitherto detested the schools are today zealously setting up evening classes. They always disliked the, quote, foreign-style school. I, too, used to identify myself with the general run of, quote, foreign-style students and teachers, end quote, and stand up for it, feeling always that the peasants were, quote, stupid and detestable people, end quote. Only in the 14th year of the Republic, 1925, when I lived in the countryside for half a year, did I realize that I had been wrong and the peasants' reasoning was extremely correct. The texts used in the rural or primary schools were entirely about urban things and unsuited to rural needs. Now the peasants are enthusiastically establishing evening classes, which they call, quote, peasant schools. Before long, tens of thousands of schools will have sprung up in the villages through the province. This is quite different from the empty talk about, quote, universal education, which the intelligentsia and so-called, quote, educationalists have been bandying back and forth, and which after all this time remain an empty phrase, end quote. Mao. In this remarkable passage, Mao combines anti-urbanism and a hostility to intellectuals, themes common to populist ideologies, but ones alien to the Marxist tradition. His celebration of the, quote, evening classes that the peasants were establishing on their own initiative, contrasted to the, quote, empty talk of urban intellectuals, was to grow into a general distrust of intellectuals and a perception of the cities as dens of moral corruption and centers of political reaction. These strains in the Hunan Report went into the making of the intellectual preconditions for the Maoist strategy of revolution. It was a strategy born partly out of necessity, partly out of conviction, that was to take the seemingly fantastic form of mobilizing the forces of peasant revolution in the countryside to, quote, surround and overwhelm, end quote, the conservative cities. Had it not been for the brutal counter-revolution of 1927, Mao Zedong's commentary on the Hunan peasant movement might well have cut short his career as a communist. That report propounded two heresies that no Marxist-Leninist party could have tolerated. First, Mao denied the cardinal Marxist belief that the urban proletariat was the principal agent of modern revolution. Secondly, Mao questioned the sacrosanct place of the Communist Party by attributing to the peasantry the revolutionary consciousness that Leninists insisted was embodied in the party. Were these not blasphemous enough, Mao had also challenged the authority of the Comintern in Moscow, where Stalin now reigned. The Chinese revolutionary movement turned increasingly radical in the last few months of 1926. The Stalinist message from Moscow was to curb the, quote, excesses of the masses, particularly the peasantry, for fear of undermining the communist alliance with the Kuomintang. The alliance had to persevere at all costs. Stalin insisted, even if those costs had to be borne by Chinese revolutionaries. While most CCP leaders faithfully carried out Comintern policy, although often reluctantly, Mao dissented, passionately defending the, quote, excesses of peasant rebels. As he wrote in the Hunan Report, quote, turning everything upside down, they, the peasants, have even created a kind of terror in the countryside. This is what some people call, quote, going too far. Such talk may seem plausible, but in fact it is wrong. First, the local bullies, bad gentry, and lawless landlords have themselves driven the peasants to this. The peasants keep clear accounts, and very seldom has the punishment exceeded the crime, end quote. Mao. In a passage that was to be repeatedly quoted over the decades, quote, a revolution is not like inviting people to dinner, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle. A revolution is an uprising, an act of violence. All actions which have been labeled as, quote, excessive had revolutionary significance, ... To put it bluntly, it is necessary to bring out a brief reign of terror in every rural area, otherwise you could never suppress the activities of the counter-revolutionaries in the countryside or overthrow the authority of the gentry. To right a wrong, it is necessary to exceed the proper limits, end quote. Mao. New section, Counter-Revolution. Mao Zedong's ideological heresies and his none too veiled criticism of the Comintern and Stalin threatened disciplinary action from the Communist Party of China and perhaps its expulsion from the party altogether. But the party's reaction was cut short when Chiang Kai-shek turned against his erstwhile communist allies in April 1927 and violently destroyed the radical mass organizations. In the cities, the working class was terrorized into submission and it was to remain politically quiescent until the late 1940s. The greatest slaughters took place in the countryside, however. In Hunan province alone, more than 500,000 peasants perished under the military repression, and the peasant unions Mao so enthusiastically celebrated in his report of February 1927 disappeared entirely. During the early summer of 1927, the White Terror was spreading from city to city through much of the countryside. Mao advocated more radical agrarian policies. He did so in his capacity as a GMD agrarian official, although now as a spokesman for the left-wing faction of the Nationalist Party that had broken with Chiang Kai-shek and established a rival government in the city of Wuhan. Mao now set forth the militant slogan, quote, land to the tiller, and advocated the confiscation and redistribution of virtually all land holdings of any substantial size, with the exception of land owned by families of, quote, revolutionary soldiers. Yet in 1927 it mattered little what rural policies were proclaimed. The left-wing GMD governed at Wuhan, with whom the communists still cooperated, had neither the will nor the power to alter existing social relationships in the countryside. The Chinese Communist Party was even less receptive to Mao Zedong's radical proposals for rural revolution. At the Fifth Communist Party Congress, which convened in Wuhan in May 1927, a month after Chiang Kai-shek's coup in Shanghai, Mao's proposal for land redistribution was ignored by party leaders. Mao later recalled that the Chinese Communist Party Secretary General Chen Dushou, quote, did not understand the role of the peasantry in the revolution and greatly underestimated its possibilities at this time. Consequently, the Fifth Communist Party Congress, held on the eve of the crisis of the Great Revolution, failed to pass an adequate land program. Mine opinions which called for rapid intensification of the agrarian struggle were not even discussed, end quote. Mao. But it probably made little difference. Had the Communist Party pursued Mao's policy of radical rural revolution in May 1927, or the calls of Trotsky and others for radical workers' revolution in the cities, it is unlikely that the Communists would have avoided the crushing defeat that they suffered in 1927, a defeat that very nearly extinguished the Chinese Communist Party. Fewer than 10,000 or 60,000 party members remained at the end of that fateful year. Most of the relatively few communists who survived were forced out of the cities, separated from the urban working class, and forced to flee to the more remote areas of the countryside. The ruins of the revolutionary movement set the stage for the rise of Mao Zedong to communist leadership. Although it was to prove a prolonged and somewhat bizarre struggle that was not to be fully settled until the early 1940s. Mao had been arguing since 1925 that the peasantry was the main class in China's, quote, national revolution. The communists now had no choice but to turn to the peasantry if only for survival. The decisive blows against the Communist Party of China and the popular revolutionary movement had been struck by Chiang Kai-shek, beginning in Shanghai in April 1927, and the decisive factor, simply put, was that Chiang had an effective army and the communists did not. The fact was not lost on Mao Zedong, who derived from the disasters of 1927 the elementary lesson that for the communists to achieve political success in the modern Chinese historical environment, they would have to have their own military force. From the recognition of the brutal fact came the oft-quoted maxim that, quote, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, end quote. A slogan Mao first set forth in the summer of 1927. It was hardly an original thought. Chiang Kai-shek knew and practiced the maxim well before Mao fully grasped it. Nor was it the case that other Chinese communist leaders were oblivious to the political uses of military power. Chinese communists attempted to gain as much influence as they could in the army that the Russian communists had built for the Kuomintang, but the notion that the CCP should have its own army did not come naturally to most of the intellectuals who led the CCP. They had assumed, as did most Marxists, that the revolution would essentially be a political struggle and that a resort to armed conflict would be no more than a temporary expedient. It was left to Mao to make explicit the notion of revolution based on military force and to act in accordance with it. Over the next 2 decades, the building of the Red Army was at the heart of Mao's revolutionary strategy. The events of 1927 also made Mao distrustful of Moscow. The policies laid down by Stalin and imposed on the Chinese communists through the agency of the Comintern had led the Chinese party to a nearly fatal defeat. On matters of Chinese revolutionary strategy, he now followed his own judgment, while paying ritualistic observance to the authority of Moscow. The rituals, however, did not disguise the fact, least of all to the immediate participants, that Mao's rise to power was to come in defiance of Moscow and in direct conflict with Chinese Communist Party factions backed by Stalin. New section, the birth of the Red Army. After the counter-revolution of 1927, Mao Zedong strongly urged the remaining communists to retreat to the rural areas by, quote, going up the mountains, end quote, as Mao put it. Quote, we can create a foundation for our real military force, end quote. Here in embryonic form were announced the 2 essential features of the emerging Maoist strategy of revolution. First, the peasantry was to be the Communist Party's mass base, and secondly, the party was to build its own army. Mao Zedong's insistence that the peasantry was the truly revolutionary class, at least in China, again brought him into conflict with the Communist Party of China leadership and the Comintern. Mao did not shrink from the battle. Indeed, he seemed to invite it. At the emergency conference, a meeting of the Central Committee of the CCP held on August 7, 1927, to reassess party policy in the wake of the disasters of the preceding spring and summer, and to blame the failures on Chengdu Show, Mao was blunt in his critique of the CCP. Quote, the peasants want a revolution, and party members close to the peasants also want a revolution, but the upper level of the party is a different story. Yet the party's guidance is not revolutionary. There really is a hint of something counter-revolutionary about it. I have established these views under the guidance of the peasants, end quote. Mao was not content simply to celebrate the revolutionary potential of the peasantry. He insisted on contrasting the spontaneous revolutionary strivings of the peasant masses with the conservatism of the Communist Party. Far from seeing the party as bringing revolutionary consciousness to the amorphous movement of the masses in Leninist fashion, Mao depicted the party as an obstacle to the natural revolutionary yearnings of the peasants. At the same time, he portrayed himself as the repository of wisdom of the masses, claiming by no means as humbly as he perhaps intended it to appear, that he had arrived at his views about revolution, quote, under the guidance of the peasants, end quote. Both of these propositions, the dichotomy between the revolutionary masses and the conservative party, and the implicit claim to be the spokesman for the peasant masses, were to be recurrent themes in Mao's long political career. The views that Mao Zedong set forth in 1927, the belief that peasants were the principal revolutionary class, and the argument that the revolution could succeed only by employing organized military force, were ideas alien to the Marxist tradition. Even after Lenin's revisions of original Marxist doctrine, peasants were soon no more than a, quote, auxiliary force in the bourgeois democratic phase of the revolution. And while Marxists generally assumed that a socialist revolution would necessarily involve violence, in the form of popular armed insurrections, perhaps on the model of the Paris Commune of 1871, that the notion that a revolution could be the work of an army was a concept well beyond the imagination of most Marxists. But the peculiarities of political conditions in China, especially after the catastrophes of 1927, brought home to most Chinese communists the lesson that political success, Indeed, political survival was dependent on the control of military force. Thus, in the summer of 1927, the Chinese Communists attempted to organize their own army, mainly around Communist-led units of the Nationalist Army that had defected. The scattered military forces that eventually were to be called the Red Army initially attempted to seize cities with the aim of stimulating working-class uprisings. A series of desperate military adventures followed. The most ambitious was an ultimately failed effort of communist-led soldiers to stimulate an insurrection on the 1st of August in Nanchang, the capital of Jiangxi province, an event that was to be later celebrated as the official birthday of the Red Army. Another involved the dispatch of Mao Zedong to Hunan province, where he hastily organized a military force of 3,000 men, mostly peasants, supplemented by unemployed Anyuan coal miners, vagabonds, and soldiers who had deserted the Nationalist Army. They proceeded to attack the provincial capital. But in Changsha, as elsewhere, the anticipated popular uprising did not materialize, for everywhere the urban workers, defeated and demoralized by the events of the spring and summer, had been terrorized into submission as had turned politically apathetic. Mao's loosely organized force was mauled by local warlord armies. At the end of September, Mao gathered 1,000 soldiers who remained of his defeated force, now known as the Red Army, and fled to the Jinggang Mountains, a remote bandit hideout bordering the provinces of Hunan and Jiangxi. New section, Jinggangshan, 1927 to 29. The prospects for revolution could hardly have been less promising than the conditions that Mao and his followers encountered in the Jinggang Mountains in October 1927. The desolate Hunan-Jiangxi border, sparsely populated by desperately impoverished peasants, was not only far removed from cities, but it was also isolated from most of the rural population. Mao was forced to rely on displaced and wandering people, vagabonds, bandits, and beggars. But such social groups Marxists traditionally categorized as, quote, lumpen proletarians, portrayed as a politically dangerous class whose miserable conditions of life made them prey to reactionary political demagogues. But Mao's view of China's vast army of urban and rural, quote, lumpen proletarians was not formed in an orthodox Marxist mold. Indeed, Mao's search for a sanctuary in the Jinggangshan had been greatly assisted by his efforts to win the trust of two secret society leaders whose vagabond forces held sway over the remote mountain range and its sparse population. Essentially leaders of bandit gangs, these activities were tempered by a sense of social justice, and they shared with the communists a hatred of landlords. In exchange for guns, they provided Mao's soldiers with food and information, and they soon joined the tiny communist force, adding 600 men to the 1,000 soldiers Mao had brought to the barren area. Mao soon came under criticism from the urban party leaders for recruiting, quote, vagrants, thereby undermining the, quote, proletarian character of his small army. He defended the practice by observing that, quote, workers and peasants are hard to come by, unquote, and that the, quote, vagrants are after all, particularly good fighters, unquote. But most interestingly, he argued that lumpen proletarians could be transformed into revolutionaries through, quote, political training and ideological remolding. For what was important for Mao was not social class, but, quote, class consciousness, and the latter was not dependent on actual social class. Quote, proletarian class consciousness could be acquired through practical experience, political training, and education, irrespective of social class. Mao Zedong's definition of class in terms of, quote, consciousness, rather than according to objective social measurements, was in part a matter of necessity. There were, after all, few proletarians in Mao's small army and little prospect of recruiting urban workers. The Red Army, as it came to be called, was dependent on desperately poor peasants, wandering people who had been driven from the land, vagrants, vagabonds, and sometimes bandits. But if there were no proletarians to lead, there was a, quote, proletarian consciousness, unquote, that could be taught. Mao's faith in eventual revolutionary success was sustained by a voluntaristic faith in the power of consciousness to transform social reality in its own ideal image. The enormous emphasis on the power of ideas in the making of history was to remain one of the central features of Maoism, and the blurring of the distinction between, quote, class and, quote, class consciousness, born in the desperate days on the Jinggangshan, was to become one of the most contentious and perplexing issues in the history of Chinese communist politics. The 16 months in the Jinggang Mountains, from October 1927 to January 1929, involved a struggle for survival. A year after his flight to the mountains, Mao wrote a report to the Central Committee, including the comment, quote, We are acutely aware that the revolutionary tide is ebbing daily in the country as a whole. So we are reduced to contending for the country in this cold atmosphere. We have an acute sense of our isolation." End quote. Now, on the Jinggangshan, the communists were able to fight off attacks from various Kuomintang and warlord armies, but Mao's forces suffered heavy losses when they descended to the plains to seek supplies and recruits. Mao's Gangshan base was considerably strengthened when he was joined early in 1928 by Zhu Dai, a communist military commander who had been wandering through southern China with several thousand troops since the defeat of the Nanchang Uprising in August 1927. The combined force was called the quote, Fourth Front Army, and popularly known as the quote, Mao Zhu Army, with Zhu Dai as military commander and Mao as political commissar. Other remnant communist military forces, most notably several hundred soldiers led by Peng Dehuai, a regimental commander in the Nationalist Army who became a communist early in 1928, gravitated to Jinggangshan. In all, together with new recruits, Mao's army numbered about 10,000 soldiers a year after he had fled to the mountains. Jinggangshan itself, with its steep and craggy cliffs overlooking fog-shrouded narrow passes, was relatively secure, but it had little else to recommend it. Inhabitants were few and resources were scarce. There were only 6 villages in the area. Mao Zedong reported, quote, "Formerly, all these places were dens of bandits and deserters. The population is under 2,000 and the rice production is less than 10,000 shi." End quote. Mao. To seek recruits and acquire food and supplies, it was necessary to descend to the plains. But to do so was to risk battles with larger and better armed Kuomintang and warlord forces, inevitably causing heavy losses for the inexperienced troops of the Red Army. As Mao somberly noted, quote, "Ordinarily, soldiers need 6 months to a year's training before they go into battle. Our soldiers recruited only yesterday have to fight today with virtually no training. Consequently, part of the middle and lower ranking cadres, as well as many soldiers, now know very little about the art of war and rely only on their bravery. This is very dangerous." End quote. Mao. It bordered on the miraculous that Mao's tiny army survived at all. Surrounded on all sides by hostile armies, depleted by desertions and illness, primitively armed and ill-trained and suffering fearsome casualties, the prospects for the Mao Zhu army in 1928 could hardly have been bleaker. Commenting on the primitive state of medical care, Mao wrote, quote, "After every engagement there are wounded. Because of malnutrition, cold, and other factors, many officers and soldiers are ill. We found a Red Army hospital on the Jinggangshan, which employs both Chinese and Western medicine for diagnosis and treatment, but we are short of both medicine and doctors. Only a tiny percentage of those who experienced the ordeals on the Jiangshan lived to follow Mao and Shu in the perilous descent to the Jiangxi Plains in January 1929. Yet the Red Army had won new recruits, mostly from China's enormous population of wandering people, Yu-Min, and had modestly increased its numbers. Mao attributed the survival of his military forces to what he called, quote, democracy, by which he primarily meant egalitarianism. Quote, "The reason why the Red Army can hold out despite such miserable material conditions and continuous fierce battles lies in its thorough implementation of democracy. The officers do not beat the soldiers. Officers and men have some food and clothing and receive equal treatment. Soldiers enjoy freedom of assembly and speech. Over-elaborate formalities have been abolished. All financial transactions are completely open, and the soldiers' representatives inspect the accounts." End quote. Mao may have championed the superiority of, quote, spiritual over, quote, material factors, but at the end of 1928, Mao concluded that deteriorating physical conditions necessitated abandoning Jinggangshan. The morale of his small army had been undermined. The Red Army hospital overflowed with sick and wounded soldiers, and the mountain fortress was surrounded by 25,000 nationalist troops dispatched by Chiang Kai-shek, to whom the small communist base seemed more a political nuisance than a military threat. For the communists, the Kuomintang blockade threatened economic strangulation, preventing communist forces from descending to the plains, where they had sustained themselves by requisitioning food and money from landlords. The Jinggangshan had been, at best, a place for the remnant communist forces to survive. Now even survival was in grave doubt. Thus, at the beginning of 1929, the preparations were made to abandon the base. Mao and Zhu Dai led the bulk of the Red Army, some 3,500 men, marching and crawling single file over huge boulders and jagged peaks, braving snowstorms and icy winds, and fighting rearguard actions against pursuing Guomindang troops. The remaining 800 under the command of Peng Dehuai held out on Jinggangshan to guard 1,000 sick and wounded soldiers along with a small number of women and children. Although they suffered heavy losses in the descent from the Jinggangshan, 600 soldiers were killed in one battle alone. The main force of the Red Army remained intact and eventually established a new base in southern Jiangxi. Peng Dehuai, who had been left to defend the Jinggangshan base, fared far worse. A week after Mao and Zhu departed, the mountain fortress was overrun by Guomindang troops, who outnumbered the defenders by 30-1. Most of the sick and wounded were slaughtered. Fewer than 300 of the 800 soldiers whom Peng Dehuai had led to Jinggangshan survived the escape to the Jiangxi plains. The Red Army, even with new recruits, Mao reported in April 1929, numbered only 3,600 men, sharing 1,100 guns between them. But the communists now found themselves in a heavily populated rural area with abundant material resources. In striking contrast to the barrenness of the Jianggang Mountains, southern Jiangxi was a relatively prosperous part of the countryside where social class differentiations were closely demarcated. Substantial numbers of peasants were attracted by the communist promise of land redistribution and the egalitarianism of the Red Army. In the new environment, the Mao Zhu army flourished, winning local peasant recruits as well as deserters from the Nationalist Army. The main body of the Red Army grew into a formidable force of 40,000 soldiers by the early 1930s and controlled substantial territories in southern Jiangxi near the Fujian border. The survival and growth of the Red Army after its near extinction on the Jinggangshan is one of the most remarkable chapters in the annals of the 20th century military and political history. Mao Zedong attributed the capacity of his tiny army of poorly armed and half-starved soldiers to remain a cohesive military force to a combination of political and tactical factors. The political basis of the Red Army's survival against overwhelming odds, Mao suggested, was adherence to a common ideology, which imparted a sense of mission and purpose that other armies in warlord-torn China lacked. But he especially emphasized the importance of, quote, simple rules of discipline, end quote, the Red Army soldiers were required to observe, and which brought peasants, quote, everywhere to volunteer to help the revolution, end quote. Most of these were quite prosaic, but no less politically efficacious because of that. After the descent of the Jinggang Mountains, Mao enumerated 8 such rules to be added to the code of Red Army soldiers. Quote, replace all doors, bracket, used to fashion a bed, and bracket, when you leave a house. 2. Return and roll up the straw matting on which you sleep. Be courteous and polite to the people and help them when you can. 4. Return all borrowed articles. 5. Replace all damaged articles. 6. Be honest in all transactions with the peasants. 7. Pay for all articles purchased. 8. Be sanitary and especially establish latrines of a safe distance from people's houses. End quote. Mao. These rules of behavior, which by all accounts were in fact largely observed during the revolutionary years, distinguished the Red Army from the predatory practices for which most Chinese armies of the time were notorious. For the peasants who bore the brunt of the depredations of rampaging military forces, the Red Army stood in striking contrast to other armies and served to greatly reinforce the appeals of communist land redistribution policies. Respect for the peasant population, demonstrated by what Mao called, quote, simple rules of discipline, end quote, contributed greatly to the remarkable expansion of the Red Army in the late 1929, now able to draw recruits from a populous rural society. Yet peasant support for the Red Army presupposed the military viability of that army, an army constantly confronted with the overwhelming numerical and technological superiority of nationalist and warlord forces. The survival of the Red Army owed a great deal to the innovative tactics that Mao Zedong began to employ in the Jinggang Mountains, and which were developed more fully in southern Jiangxi. Maoist military doctrine is typically described as a form of guerrilla warfare. Indeed, Mao himself declared that, quote, ours are guerrilla tactics, end quote. And these tactics include the classical 4-line slogan adapted from the ancient Chinese military strategy, and were sighted by communist troops defending the Jianganshan base. Quote, the enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue. End quote. But Mao's conception of guerrilla warfare, particularly as it evolved in southern Jiangxi around 1930, was quite different from what it commonly understood by that term. He ignored a directive from the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee ordering the Red Army, in the interest of self-preservation, to be broken down into small and more or less autonomous guerrilla bands. Quote, the Central Committee, Mao replied in April 1929, quote, asks us to divide our forces into very small units and disperse them over the countryside, end quote. Mao. However, Mao objected, quote, we have tried this, bracket guerrilla tactics, and bracket many times, but it failed every time, end quote. The failures in turn were attributed to the, quote, weak leadership and organization, end quote, that inevitably results from the division into small units and the danger that such units would be, quote, crushed by the enemy one by one, end quote. Rather than dividing the Red Army into guerrilla bands to compensate for its numerical and technological inferiority, Mao drew the opposite conclusion, quote, the more adverse the circumstances, the greater the need for concentration, because only thus can we have internal unity to resist the enemy, end quote. Mao. Rather than guerrilla warfare in the conventional sense, Mao advocated what he called, quote, protracted warfare. Instead of what he disparaged as, quote, roving guerrilla actions, end quote, Mao favored, quote, luring the enemy deep, end quote, into the communist-controlled areas and, quote, concentrating our forces to destroy the enemy one by one, end quote. Mao. Such tactics presuppose that the Red Army would have great flexibility and mobility, usually identified with guerrilla-type warfare. It is also understood, however, that in any given battle, Red Army forces would ideally be relatively concentrated while enemy forces would be dispersed. It is remarkable that the Red Army between October 1927 and January 1929 did not degenerate into the, quote, roving bandit gangs, end quote, that communist officials in Moscow and Shanghai sometimes suggested they were becoming. Yet even in the most perilous times, Mao was successful in enforcing, quote, civilian control of military power, that is, in ensuring the subordination of the Red Army to the authority of the Communist Party. In a situation marked by almost constant warfare and what often seemed a totally hopeless enterprise, the distinction between party and army, between civilian and military authority, was rather murky. Mao, the political leader, was also deeply immersed in the details of military operations, and the lines between party and army were blurred. Nonetheless, Mao insisted on maintaining the distinction between the two, and on the whole was successful in keeping the Red Army, formerly commanded by Zhu De, obedient to the civilian authority of the party. It was an arrangement to be canonized by the Maoist maxim, quote, the party commands the gun shall never be allowed to command the party, end quote. Finally, a crucial principle of Mao's strategy of, quote, protracted war, only incompletely implemented on the Jianganshan, was the establishment of strategically defensible and economically self-sufficient base areas. Self-sufficiency presupposed a substantial settled rural population from which recruits to the Red Army could be drawn, and an economy adequate to support both the population and the needs of the Red Army. Such bases, Mao advised, were to be established in the more remote regions bordering several provinces, where central state control was relatively weak and where the communists could best exploit divisions among their enemies. New section, the Jiangxi Soviet. Once established on the populous southern Jiangxi plains, the Red Army grew rapidly, attracting peasant recruits and deserters from warlord and local military forces. By 1930, Mao was sufficiently confident to proclaim a provisional Soviet government, consolidating a dozen smaller communist-controlled areas with his own base area. But Mao was still formally under the authority of the CCP Central Committee in Shanghai. This mattered rather little during the precarious days in the Jianggang Mountains, when communications with Shanghai were remote and erratic, and when Mao's struggle in the remote mountains seemed a hopeless adventure, attracting little notice among members of the Central Committee. But after the descent to the Jiangxi countryside and the expansion of Mao's forces, the CCP Central Committee and its new Comintern installed leader, Li San, were determined to assert their authority over the rapidly growing Maoist movement. Li San and Mao had known each other since their youth as activists in the May 4th movement. Li had become firmly wedded to the Marxist faith in the urban proletariat as the true revolutionary class. Quote, all the talk of, quote, encircling the city with the countryside, end quote, or on relying on the Red Army to take the cities is sheer nonsense, end quote, he impatiently declared. The success of the Chinese Revolution depended on reactivating the proletariat. Thus he ordered the Red Army centered in rural Jiangxi to attack cities with the aim of stimulating working-class uprisings. The Red Army attacks launched in the summer of 1930 against far larger Kuomintang armies proved disastrous. Troops commanded by Mao and Zhu De reluctantly participated in two of these adventures: an abortive drive to capture the provincial capital of Nanchang and an attack on Changsha. Quote, there was no workers' uprising, end quote, Mao reported to the Central Committee to explain why he abruptly called off the attempt to seize Changsha after 12 days of fighting on the outskirts of the city. Mao later learned that in the wake of the attack, a Kuomintang commander discovered that Mao's wife, Yang Kai-hui, was still living in Changsha. She was arrested, interrogated, and when she refused to denounce Mao, summarily executed. Their 3 children were rescued by friends and sent to live in Shanghai. To some extent, Mao shared Li San's revolutionary zealousness, if not necessarily his faith in the proletariat. In the spring of 1929, Mao foresaw a, quote, revolutionary high tide, unquote, which would enable the Red Army to conquer all of Jiangxi province. He was not opposed in principle to using peasant armies to seize cities, if militarily feasible, but his aim was to expand the power and resources of communist base areas, not primarily to activate the proletariat. For Mao, the poor peasantry remained the true revolutionary class in China, as he had come to believe in 1926, and his faith was reinforced in urban workers, still demoralized by the defeats of 1927, remained politically quiescent when the Red Army launched attacks on cities in 1930. The Red Army suffered heavy losses in attempting to carry out Li San's instructions to seize major cities in the summer of 1930. Hardly had they recovered from adventures at Nanchang and Changsha, then the communists fell into an orgy of self-destruction in the murderous train of events surrounding the, quote, Fuxian incident of December 1930. New section, Fuxian, or Futian, I don't know how to say it. I'll just go with Fuxian, F-U-T-I-A-N. The rapid growth of the Red Army in Jiangxi province in 1929 was greatly facilitated by the incorporation of local Jiangxi Communist Party organizations and guerrilla forces. It was not an entirely harmonious union, however. The Jiangxi Communists had been operating independently since the breakup of the Kuomintang Communist Party alliance in 1927, and gained considerable political and social influence as well as a significant military presence in the southwestern areas of the province by the time that Mao's beleaguered army found refuge there. It was Mao's attempt in 1930 to place the indigenous Jiangxi communist movement under the firm control of his own expanding political military base in Jiangxi that led to the most bloody internal conflict in the history of the Communist Party of China. Issues of both power and policy were involved in the events that issued from the Fuxian incident. The dispute between Mao and the Jiangxi communist leaders stemmed in large measure from provincial and regional differences and what was not yet a unified national revolutionary movement. The soldiers of the main Mao Zedong Red Army were mostly Hunanese. They were looked upon as outsiders by the local Jiangxi communists as soldiers of a, quote, guest army that would soon be moving on. But behind these elemental provincial antagonisms lay important differences in social interests and political orientations. Most of the Jiangxi communist leaders were the sons of gentry, landlord, or rich peasant families. This itself did not distinguish them from the leaders of the Maoist movement, many of whom also came from relatively prosperous families. Mao himself, of course, was the son of a rich peasant, by virtue of which he had been among the less than 1% of young Chinese of his generation to be afforded a university education. But Mao, and most other surviving Maoist leaders, had long cut themselves off from their families and localities. The Jiangxi communists, by contrast, lived and worked in or near their home districts and retained deep social and political ties to local communities. These differing relationships to society in southern Jiangxi manifested themselves in controversies over two crucial issues. One was land reform. One was land reform. Mao was now, at least temporarily, advocating a radical land redistribution policy based on the number of family members that would have adversely affected the interest of, quote, rich peasants. On the other hand, the Jiangxi leaders, more sensitive to local interests, favored a less egalitarian policy of land redistribution based on a family's labor power. A second controversy revolved around the military tactics to be employed to defend the communist base in Jiangxi, while the anticipated attack by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army. A second controversy revolved around the military tactics to be employed to defend the communist base in Jiangxi against the anticipated attack by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army. While Mao insisted on employing the tactic of, quote, luring the enemy deep, end quote, which had enabled the Red Army to survive in the Jinggang Mountains against far superior enemy forces, the Jiangxi communist leaders feared that the immediate result of doing so would be heavy loss of life and property in their home districts, even if the tactic proved to be militarily efficacious in the long run. These disputes within the communist base area in Jiangxi were reflected in differing attitudes toward the National Party leadership located in Shanghai, where the Central Committee was now led by Li Lisan. Mao was bitterly hostile to Li and the, quote, Li Lisan line of using the Red Army to attack cities in the hope of stimulating working-class uprisings. The Jiangxi communist leaders, on the other hand, generally supported Li Lisan, partly because his agrarian policies conformed with their own preferences, and partly because his military strategy of attacking cities precluded Mao's mobile tactics and implied instead a conventional defense of the Jiangxi base area. It also had the virtue of moving Mao's Red Army out of the base area, at least temporarily, thereby increasing the influence of the local Jiangxi communist leaders. These issues and the political struggles they generated led to a deepening antagonism between Mao and the Jiangxi communist leaders. While Mao had tenuously incorporated local communist military forces into the Red Army, Jiangxi Communist Party groups had retained a de facto independence and remained in hostile opposition to the Maoists. In February 1930, Mao widened the rift, charging that the, quote, local leading organs of the party at all levels are filled with landlords and rich peasants, and the party's policy is completely opportunistic, end quote. Mao. The struggle between Mao and the Jiangxi communists was complicated, and the hostility between them was exacerbated in the spring when rumors spread through the communist-controlled areas that the Red Army and the Communist Party had been infiltrated by a secret Kuomintang counter-revolutionary organization known as the, quote, A.B. Tuan, whose name is usually taken to mean Anti-Bolshevik League. The A.B. Tuan was a right-wing faction within the Kuomintang organized under the aegis of Chiang Kai-shek during the 1925-27 revolutionary upsurge. Its original purpose was to limit communist influence in the GMD-CCP alliance through clandestine means. The League was particularly strong in southern Jiangxi, where after the Kuomintang Communist Party split in 1927, its principal task was to root out communist influence in local Kuomintang organizations. While the existence of a secret A.B. Tuan in Jiangxi is no longer in doubt, it is most unlikely that it could have exercised the pervasive powers that both Mao and the Jiangxi communists attributed to it. Nevertheless, communist fears that their ranks had been infiltrated by A.B. Tuan agents grew in the late spring and summer of 1930, reaching frenzied heights during the end of the year, as nationalist armies surrounded the communist base area, preparing to launch a, quote, encirclement and annihilation, end quote, campaign. Mao Zedong was apparently not directly involved in the initial large-scale purges of real or alleged A.B. Tuan agents in the Communist Party and the Red Army. He and Zhu Dai had reluctantly obeyed the order of Li Lisan and the Central Committee to lead the Red Army to launch attacks on major cities. An abortive move toward the city of Nanchang at the end of July was followed by the failed attack on the Changsha in Hunan province in late August and early September, while Mao and the main units of the Red Army were away from the base area, engaged in futile efforts to implement the, quote, Li Lisan line. Local communist leaders took control of the southern Jiangxi party organization, repealed Mao's radical land reform policies, and announced their support for Li Lisan and his policies, and inaugurated a widespread purge of A.B. Tuan suspects, replete with summary executions. When Mao returned to Jiangxi in October, he regained command of the local party organization and ordered an even broader purge of A.B. Tuan suspects. Some 4,400 officers and soldiers of the Red Army were arrested, many of them Jiangxi natives, and half of them were summarily executed, often on the basis of confessions and accusations obtained through torture. Soldiers in the 20th Red Army, a force made up of mostly Jiangxi men who had been left behind to defend the communist base, while the main units of the Red Army were engaged in the hopeless adventure of attacking Nanchang and Changsha, mutinied when the purge reached them in early December. The rebellious soldiers attacked the old imperial Yamen (local administrative office) in the small market town of Fujian, where some of the victims of the purge had been imprisoned. The rebels killed 100 Red Army soldiers guarding the Yamen, freed some 20 prisoners, issued a manifesto denouncing Mao Zedong as a, quote, party emperor, and appealed to Zhu Dai and Peng Dehuai to join them in opposition to Mao. Zhu and Peng quickly reaffirmed their loyalty to Mao and condemned the rebels. But the, quote, Fujian incident coincided as it did with the Nationalist Army's assault on the communist base area, set the stage for even wider and more bloody purges. The communist attacks on urban centers in 1930, although they failed, had alarmed the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek, vowing to eliminate the, quote, communist bandits once and for all, sent 100,000 soldiers against the Jiangxi base area in a, quote, encirclement and extermination, quote, campaign. Mao Zedong and Zhu Dai, with less than half the number under their command, employed the now well-tested tactic of, quote, luring the enemy deep, end quote, during the turning back the nationalist armies in January 1931. As Mao Zedong was successfully defending the Jiangxi base against Chiang Kai-shek's first, quote, extermination campaign, he seemed to agree with most communist leaders that the purge of suspected counter-revolutionaries had been excessive. Arrests and executions of A.B. Tuan suspects in the party and Red Army continued during the early months of 1931, but at a less frenetic pace. The purge seemed to be winding down. Then in April, as 200,000 Kuomintang troops were encircling the communist base in preparation for a second, quote, extermination campaign, the purge was resumed with renewed fury. The impetus now came from the new party Central Committee in Shanghai, consisting of young Chinese communists who had been trained at Sun Yat-sen University in Moscow to do Stalin's bidding in China. Known as the, quote, returned student faction, end quote, or more colorfully as the, quote, 28 Bolsheviks. They were still mostly in their earlier mid-20s when they dispatched to Shanghai to take over the CCP Central Committee. Their leader, Wang Ming, Chen Xiaoyu, became the Communist Party's new general secretary, replacing the now disgraced Li Lisan, who was exiled to Moscow for, quote, study. The political and policy differences between Wang Ming and Li Lisan were negligible, save that Wang was even more slavish in his obedience to Stalin than Li had been. It is unlikely that Mao Zedong was impressed by this, but he did have reasons to temporarily ally himself with Wang Ming in renewing the purge of alleged A.B. Tuan elements, for it was in the political interest of both to purge the party organization of Li Lisan's supporters, which included the local Jiangxi communists whom Mao had openly clashed since February 1930. It was now the tendency among Maoists and the new Central Committee alike to conflate the A.B. Tuan with, quote, Li Lisanism. As a result, a great variety of both Mao's and Wang Ming's political opponents within the CCP would now be branded enemy agents and treated accordingly. Thus, the purge was resumed in April 1931, just as the Nationalist Army, 200,000 strong, launched Chiang Kai-shek's second, quote, extermination campaign against the communist base in Jiangxi. Was more widespread and indiscriminate than ever, consuming many thousands of loyal communists on vague suspicions that they were A.B. Tuan infiltrators or other counter-revolutionaries. Mao Zedong certainly participated in the purges, probably directing his energies to bring about the demise of supporters of Li Lisan, which included most of the original Jiangxi communist leaders who had founded the base area. But the witch hunt was not simply a Maoist affair, as the leading historian of the origins and aftermath of the Fujian incident has observed, quote, the questions of specifically who presided over the fierce wave of, quote, counter-revolutionary suppression, unquote, that spread through the Soviet areas during the latter half of 1931 is rendered considerably less important, however, by the fact that the purges soon became so widespread, decentralized, and paranoid that for a time they were largely beyond the control of any of the top leaders, end quote. The ferocity of the purges began to abate in the fall of 1931 after Mao led the Red Army in successfully resisting the third, quote, annihilation and extermination, end quote, campaign, which Chiang Kai-shek had launched in July, throwing 300,000 soldiers against the communist base. The defeat of the nationalist forces, along with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in September 1931, was to provide the communists with respite from major Kuomintang attacks until the spring of 1933. The terrible purges of real or alleged counter-revolutionaries in 1930 to 31 were in large measure the result of a collective hysteria that enveloped the communist base area when it was surrounded by the nationalist army during Chiang Kai-shek's first three, quote, extermination campaigns. Few participants in the tiny revolutionary movement in Jiangxi believed that they would survive the imminent onslaughts of enemy armies, far superior both in numbers and military technology. They were well aware of the waves of counter-revolutionary white terror which had swept over the land unimpeded since 1927 and already taken millions of lives in a pitiless civil war. A pervasive fear of death provided fertile ground for the spread of rumors in the CCP and the Red Army that their ranks were filled with spies and traitors, and the besieged communists struck out against each other in a frenzied witch hunt against suspected enemy agents. It was to reinforce a Stalinist tendency in the Communist Party to attribute internal dissent to, quote, counter-revolutionary elements, end quote, who had infiltrated the party from without. Mao Zedong and others certainly used the fears and confusion that enveloped the Jiangxi base in 1930 and 1931 to purge their political opponents in the Communist Party and pursue their own political ambitions, which they no doubt believed to be in the best interests of the revolution. It has long been known that it was during these years that Mao greatly expanded his influence in the Chinese Communist movement. But while Mao no doubt aimed to win control of the Communist Party, he was notably unsuccessful in the attempt. Hardly had the purge of, quote, counter-revolutionaries begun to wane when Mao's powers in the Communist base in Jiangxi began to be undermined. In the summer and autumn of 1931, the party's Central Committee, under increasing police pressure in Shanghai, moved its headquarters to Jiangxi, or more precisely to the small southern Jiangxi market town of Ruiqin near the border with Fujian province, which had been made the capital of the newly proclaimed Chinese Soviet Republic. Mao Zedong was the chairman of the republic, which was soon to claim a population of about 5 million. But Mao's authority was quickly eroded by the, quote, returned student faction, end quote, whose members dominated the Central Committee. The young Mao-trained Chinese communists were hostile to Mao personally and opposed both to his military and agrarian policies. Mao remained chairman of the Soviet Republic, but soon became a mostly titular position. He was duly consulted over economic and military matters, but he no longer had any real power in either the party or the Red Army. Yet Mao retained the personal loyalty of many communists, especially officers and soldiers of the Red Army. This had less to do with the purges that preceded and followed the Fujian incident than the tactical brilliance he demonstrated in leading the Red Army to fend off Chiang Kai-shek's first three, quote, encirclement and extermination, end quote, campaigns. Mao's support among communists was also enhanced by his reputation as the party's foremost expert on rural affairs. Since 1925, when he discovered the peasantry as the true revolutionary class, he had immersed himself in painstaking investigations of rural, social, and economic life. It was this passion that resulted in his appointment as principal of the Kuomintang's Peasant Movement Training Institute during the revolutionary upsurge of 1926, and which produced the document that announced the birth of Maoism, the report on the peasant movement in Hunan. Thereafter, wherever his revolutionary activities took him, even during the perilous days in the Jianggang Mountains, he seized every opportunity to carry out first-hand investigations of the conditions under which rural people lived. One of the most impressive of these many accounts was a remarkably detailed study, several hundred pages in length, of the socioeconomic conditions of the inhabitants of Shunwu County in southern Jiangxi province and Shunwu City, its administrative center. The investigation was conducted with the assistance of 11 local informants during a 10-day period in May 1930 when Mao's Fourth Army was camped in the area several months before the ill-fated attacks on the Nanchang and Changsha. Mao's report meticulously recorded virtually every aspect of the social and economic life of the county, from the number of butchers and barbers to the origins and prices of hundreds of commodities. He discussed in great detail the intricacies of mortgages in the area, the multitude of taxes, the degree of literacy, and the status of women, among dozens of other topics, and he paid special attention to rural social divisions, enumerating 10 distinct social groups ranging from large landlords to hired hands and vagrants. Mao, of course, used the data in the Shunwu report and other rural investigations to support his agrarian policies against those of his party opponents. But for the most part, the Shunwu report reads more like a sociological study than a political treatise. Mao encouraged others to engage in similar social investigations immediately following the writing of the Shunwu report. He set forth the soon-to-be ubiquitous maxim, quote, "Without investigation, there is no right to speak," end quote. New section. The fall of the Jiangxi Soviet. By the time Chiang Kai-shek launched the Fourth Extermination Campaign in the late summer of 1932, Mao Zedong's authority in the Chinese Soviet Republic had been largely undermined by the, quote, returned student faction, quote, whose members had now fully re-established themselves in the party central committee in Jiangxi, accused of, quote, rightist deviation and a, quote, peasant consciousness, among other heresies common during the Stalin era. Mao found his power in the base area was whittled away, and his functions in such official positions as he still held were largely reduced to ceremonial duties. The party apparatus was controlled by the youthful Moscow-trained zealots. While Zhu De remained commander of the Red Army, Zhou Enlai had replaced Mao as the army's political commissar. But Zhou largely retained the mobile tactics that Mao favored, and the Red Army once again decisively defeated the Nationalists in a long and drawn-out campaign. This was not to be the outcome of the Fifth Campaign, which began in October 1933. Chiang Kai-shek mobilized nearly 1 million troops, outnumbering the Red Army by more than 10 to 1, and further maximized the Nationalist advantage by employing mechanized artillery and an air force of 400 bombers and fighter planes. Chiang also hired 2 German generals who devised a new blockhouse strategy to crush the communists. In early 1934, Chiang methodically tightened the ring of 14,000 blockhouses that surrounded the ever-shrinking Chinese Soviet Republic. Prospects for the survival of the Jiangxi base were not enhanced by the abandonment of Mao's tactics of mobile warfare in favor of a more conventional defense. The strategy of the Red Army was now dictated by the Comintern advisor Otto Braun, a German communist who had been trained at a military academy in Moscow and was known in China by the pseudonym Li Dai. It was a strategy based on conventional methods of positional warfare, and it inevitably failed to halt the nationalist advance. Yet it is unlikely that Mao's mobile tactics would have been successful in the end, for the numerical and technological superiority of Chiang Kai-shek's army was now overwhelming. Mao Zedong was later bitterly critical of Braun's tactics, without claiming that this his own would have saved the Chinese Soviet Republic. Quote, "It was a serious mistake," in quote, he later charged, quote, "to meet the vastly superior Nanking forces in positional warfare, in which the Red Army was neither technically nor spiritually at its best," end quote. During the summer of 1934, the dwindling communist base in Jiangxi began to crumble before the relentless Kuomintang offensive. Plans were made to escape the nationalist encirclement. In mid-October, the bulk of what remained of the Red Army, about 60,000 soldiers along with 30,000 party functionaries and bearers, managed to slip through nationalist lines to embark on an extraordinary year-long journey whose route and destination had yet to be decided. Few of the approximately 90,000 who joined the migration were to survive. Mao Zedong was among those who fled, but the original plans for what came to be celebrated as the Long March were made by Otto Braun, Bo Ku, the leader of the, quote, returned student faction, quote, and Zhou Enlai. It was during the Long March, however, that Mao was to gain a measure of mastery over a much shrunken Communist Party of China, and the legend of the Long March was to become intimately involved with the making of the legend of Mao Zedong. Okay, so that is the end of Chapter 3 of Mao Zedong, a Political and Intellectual Portrait by Maurice Meisner. Thank you so much for listening.